Very good morning, everyone. My name is Nelson Zwane. I'm the acting site curator for Ditsong, Tswaing Meteorite Crater Museum, and I will be your program director for today's discussions. Good afternoon again. Today's discussions is about variations and change in the early farm dwellings around Pretoria. I will be brief in the introduction of my speaker, who will be leading the topic. What I need to highlight, colleagues, is that at the end of the session, we will allow around, about 10 minutes of questions or so, but it's very important also to note that our speaker has got an email which is displayed on our screen. At the moment, if you need to follow up on certain questions, that might maybe take longer. In my introduction for the speaker for the day, I would like to say he is very, very knowledgeable in the field, and I look at his CV, I didn't know where to start from, but I just highlighted few things that I want to share with you before I give the platform to him. He's been a curator and a conservator for the Ditsong Museums of Natural Cultural History between 2011 and current. Among other accolades or credits in his name, between 1980 and 1983, he's been a curator for Botshabelo Mission Station and South Ndebele Open Air Museum, that is in Middelburg, Mpumalanga. He's been a lecturer between 1996 and current, lecturing in various institutions, among them is UNISA, where he was a guest lecturer at University of Pretoria and University of Potchefstroom on different topics. Between 2007 and current, he's been a member of the editorial committee, the South African the South African Journal of Art History, among others, and the Research Journal of the Ditsong Museums of Cultural History. He's been the expert consultant also in conservation of buildings and historic sites. He's being the publisher of the peer review articles 2018 and 2019. I'm talking about none other than Mr. Mauritz Naudé, whom I would like to give this opportunity to lead the discussion or this topic. And at the end of the day, as I said, colleagues, we will have some moment for questioning, but then he's also giving us his email for further discussions if one has got more questions to ask. Over to you, Mr. Naudé.
Thanks, Nelson. I hope everybody's logged in. My email, if there are any questions and we run out of time, which is quite possible, if we run out of time, my email also appears at the end of the presentation, which is just a copy of the first page, and my email is there, and you'll be able to send me any questions. Right, let's start. What I'll be talking about is variation and change in the early farm dwellings around Pretoria, which is to some extent a very generic topic, and I will explain a bit later how I got to this point. I must to some extent apologize, but at the same time I had to discipline myself. I've removed almost half of the slides because I knew that I was going to run out of time. And the slides that I've taken out are mostly those that the architects and architectural historians would have preferred. Those are the floor plans and the evolutionary drawings of how the various buildings developed and through their history. And I think that is for a separate lecture. I can surely keep you busy for another lecture on that particular topic. Okay, so why this particular topic? What is the motivation for this investigation or the study or even for the presentation? Very simple. There's a practical reason for it and there's also an academic reason for it. What is the practical reason? The practical reason is that as a curator for buildings and historic sites and also as conservator, I need to comply with the obligations of the National Heritage Resources Act. We're a government institution, and not only because of that, even as an ordinary researcher or as a landowner or as an academic, we need to comply with the obligations of the National Heritage Resources Act in terms of preservation, when we preserve it or when we want to manage it or reuse it, or even when we want to apply for a permit for maintenance and repair work. The academic side or the academic origin is based on digging deeper into the history of the sites, digging deeper into the history of the building. And really for academic and intellectual purposes, you need to analyze to the point almost of analysis paralysis these buildings in order to penetrate what the cultural significance of the value of that particular artifact is. Now, you will hear in my presentation that I often refer to buildings as objects and artifacts. They are objects and artifacts, but they're also containers. They are also pieces of the landscape. There are elements, features in the landscape, but they are the habitats for Homo sapiens and some other living beings in which they live, in which they reside. So the nice part is not to comply with the act. The nice part, the lovely part, the academic part is really what most architectural historians prefer to indulge themselves in. Now, what does it mean to comply with the legal obligations? And I've taken the text on the screen directly from section 38.3 of the National Heritage Resources Act. Now, as a curator of buildings, and if I want to comply with the Act, I must be able to answer these 9 questions. And I've subdivided the 9 questions that come directly from the Heritage Act into 2 columns. The column on the right deals mostly with social issues, and we're not going to talk about social issues. That is a lecture for another time. The column on the left, there are in total 9 questions that need to be answered as indicated, set out by the Act. And I've highlighted in those questions on the left-hand column in red, what do they expect of us? What does the Act ask from us when we assess a site or a building or even an object? Now I'm going to read through it very quickly. It says, the importance of the cultural heritage in the community or pattern of South Africa's history. Pattern is significant. So if you work in a museum, you're always looking for patterns of similarity and patterns of uniqueness or eccentricity. We look for patterns. The second one says possession of uncommon, rare, or endangered aspects of South Africa's natural and cultural history. Uncommon, rare, and endangered. Now, if you don't have any background knowledge, fieldwork knowledge, or literature knowledge of what happens in this particular, what has been published in this particular discipline, this particular field or branch of this discipline, you won't be able to determine, is it uncommon, what you see in the landscape, is it rare, or is it endangered? The third one says potential to yield information that will contribute to an understanding of South Africa's natural or cultural history. Once again, if you don't have a proper or a sound knowledge base, you won't be able to evaluate what is the potential of information, yielding information of that artifact or of that building within the discipline. What contribution does that building make in our knowledge, field of knowledge of vernacular architecture in this case, or in architectural history in general. Fourth one says importance in demonstrating the principal characteristics of a particular class of South Africa's natural or cultural places or objects. So what we see in the Act is they do address objects from a museological point of view. When we talk about objects, we usually assume these are movable things. Now, to counter the movable things, the Act refers to the other side of the coin as cultural places. Buildings with their sites and with all their supporting structures around them consist of, or rather collectively can be defined as cultural places. So you need a particular background knowledge to distinguish between these things: buildings, structures, infrastructure, open spaces, and so on. The next one says importance in exhibiting particular aesthetic characteristics valued by a community or a cultural group. I think the focus here is a particular aesthetic characteristics. It is clear that you need some basic background in architectural history or even art history, and definitely cultural history, and to some extent, even geography, to address or to answer questions asked by the Act, by this particular subsection of the Act, when you're confronted with a heritage site and a heritage building. The last one in this list, importance in demonstrating a high degree of creative or technical achievement at a particular period. This is a tricky one. When one assesses formal architecture, I would say, is the flip side of non-formal architecture or informal architecture. In some instances, it's referred to as vernacular. In some instances, it's referred to as folk architecture. Now, as we go through this presentation, you will see that probably the bulk of the examples that we will look at on the screen were not designed by architects. There may have been an input from an architect, and I will indicate to you where this happened. And it's clear that there's a category of buildings, as Bernard Radowski referred to it as, buildings or architecture without architects. And you will be confronted with this or introduced to these structures in this presentation. So that is our legal obligation, and it is within these legal terms that can also be translated into academic terms, can also be interpreted into, let's call them scientific terms, that need to give us a frame of reference or a platform or a vehicle from where to start any evaluation. And that is our legal obligation. And I'm not going to spend more time on that, because this particular aspect of heritage, we can have a completely another lecture on this particular aspect of how do we interpret what is in the Act. In tandem with these questions in the Heritage Act, there's also an obligation to look at buildings or artifacts or places of cultural significance within a value system, aesthetic values, historic values, scientific value, and so forth. So those two sets of obligations operate in tandem. And I'm not going to look into this value framework in this presentation. The reality scenario for the museum, that's for Ditsong, and probably the motivation for expanding on the study of early farm dwellings in and around Pretoria. The basis, the point of departure is that Ditsong owns the 3 properties on the screen. And we are supposed, my job is to determine the cultural significance of these properties and of these dwellings. In this study, I will only focus on dwellings. And as we go along, I'll explain to you, I'm not going into the philosophical aspect of what does it mean to dwell? Because during the early years, dwelling implied you lived in a small cottage with other service buildings around you, such as an outdoor bake oven and a outdoor kitchen, detached kitchen, and a privy, and you were only sleeping in your dwelling. But anyway, these are the three sites that forced me to comply with the act. They do belong to Ditsong, or rather Ditsong is the custodian of these three properties, except for 9 other sites of which we are the custodian. Now, even when you look at the 3 pictures, you realize that they do not look the same. To make it even more difficult, these buildings do not belong to one person, it belonged to 3 different persons, 3 different families from 3 different cultural groups. The pioneer dwelling on the left, for most of its existence, belonged to Heinrich Mundt. He was a German. And he has these, what we see on the site, the way we interpret the site and even the building would be with this at the back of our minds, that this was a farmstead belonging to a German farmer. The Prinsloo dwelling belonged to the Prinsloo family. It's a traditional Afrikaans-speaking Boer family, well-known, fairly large family in the history of Pretoria and its region, as the children married with some of the other Afrikaner families in the area. The building on the right, the Sammy Marks building, belonged to a Jew. Sammy Marks was a Jew. So even if, when studying the cultural significance, it is clear that something must have rubbed off of those 3 cultures, of those 3 individuals, and their particular preferences and biases must have rubbed off in their architecture. And I'm not going, this presentation is not going to deal with this type of approach or this particular angle. The entire presentation at this stage is what I would call an exploratory presentation, because it needs to be followed up so that individuals who have questions regarding serious architectural history issues can attend it and we can explore that. Currently, this is the scenario, and this was one of the reasons why I had to look at comparative material in order to determine cultural significance of these sites. Now, what would be our approach? What was my approach? There's a general approach in the human sciences, probably in the other sciences as well, but particularly in the human sciences. And I call it the integrated 3-point framework. The integrated 3-point framework implies that whatever we assess as museologists or artifact specialists, is you need to look at that artifact in terms of time. How old is it? Where does it come from in terms of time? And what was the time context, the period in which it appeared? It was designed, it was constructed, and how the later additions and extensions were done. When was it done? And so on. You look at it from a time context. It's also critical that you need to consider the building within its spatial framework, its environmental framework, its setting, its orientation, its topographical location. And it is, without that, you would probably lose quite a lot of useful information, especially when you deal with so-called vernacular or non-architecture design buildings. Then the critical one is right at the top. You need to understand the culture in which this artifact originated. Culture is a slippery subject. Various disciplines define culture in different ways. And I'm not going to debate culture and the various definitions. I merely would like to state that that is the golden triangle, integrated triangle that we need to use as scientists, as researchers, field workers, and academics when we look at heritage and when we look at objects. We look at all the other things as well in that particular framework. Now, the central triangle is just a graphic indication that the original creator, I don't call them designers, it's not an architect, let's call them creators. The original creator of the building also operated within exactly that same framework, except that they didn't know they operate in that framework. Nobody told them that they operated in that framework. It was inherent in their upbringing, it was inherent in the way they lived, their lifestyle, their traditions. And within when they create something, they create it within that framework with all their personal and social biases and preferences. Now, by the time the researcher arrives on the scene, that creator is gone, and he only left as an artifact. And we don't know what was the motivation for the manufacturing or the production or the construction or the erection of that building or that structure. So the researcher always remains an outsider in interpreting the artifact. And the diagram on the right merely indicates that we try to reconstruct a lifestyle. We try to reconstruct the logic behind the creation of that particular artifact. So this is the generic approach towards our point of departure when we address buildings or when we look at these buildings. Now, if you carry on this way, of course, that you can do many PhDs and master's theses on every building that you work on if you use this type of logic. So we need to narrow it down. And for this presentation, I'm not going to expand on this research methodology. To prepare this lecture, I was confronted with a blank page. I was asked to do the lecture. I promised them I would do the presentation. And I asked them, so what am I supposed to talk about? I'm a conservationist by heart, but also a keen eye for vernacular architecture and any other architecture for that matter. So I went through a number of topics, and there are several other, let's call them populist and more provocative approaches to architecture and the field in which I operate within my job description. And these are some of the more provocative approaches. I thought, okay, let's call it early farm dwellings around Pretoria, because that's what I'm going to talk about. What about visions and versions, efforts to create a shelter? That would, of course, imply that I know more about every building that I'm going to talk about, which I don't know. There are many buildings that I've visited, many sites that I visited, and I don't even have architectural drawings or even sketches of the floor plans. Visions and versions will appear in a publication at some point, but not now. The second possibility was in search of a vernacular architecture. This immediately forces me to the key or the pivotal term there, and that is, what is vernacular architecture? Also quite a slippery term, as it depends on who uses the term, and they define it differently. Vernacular architecture, the definition is probably one of those that operate the best when you say what it is not, or what formal architecture is not, and we just categorize it as vernacular. We can spend more time on the definition of vernacular. I'm currently reading an article where it is clear that the term vernacular is going through the washing machine and tumble dryer in terms of redefining vernacular. So I decided to get out of that particular avenue, which isn't a cul-de-sac, but I still don't know where's the end of it. So I thought, okay, let's look at another one, life on the urban fringe. It is clear that a topic like that would probably approach the topic from a very social or cultural historical point of departure, which I'm not going to tackle, definitely not going to tackle. In this presentation, I will refer to it and you will pick up aspects of lifestyles and traditions of individuals who lived on the urban fringe. They, of course, didn't know they were living on the urban fringe. That is an academic term or a Hollywood term to make things more visible, more visual. I now decided against that. And then the other option was to merely call what I'm going to show you during the presentation, just call it peripheral architecture. The question eventually was, when I woke up one night, I realized what I'm going to talk about is not peripheral architecture. It's probably the core of architecture. It lies at the heart of architecture. Architecture didn't start with Rem Koolhaas and Zaha Hadid. Architecture starts on the ground with mud and stone. And that is what we will probably see today in the presentation. The other one is, and the other topic is, let's call it lost heritage. To some extent, yes, we're already losing it, and we have lost it. And I will indicate to you which of these buildings we've already lost, irrespective of whether they've been protected by law, either by the 60 years clause or by official proclamation. Yes, we have lost some of these buildings. The other topic is, what does it mean to dwell? This is a philosophical question, and I thought, if there's no conversation across the floor, I'm not going to go this route. And then I decided, okay, let's call this an introduction to, or an exploratory presentation, and I called it the topic that I now have, that is variation and change of early dwellings. So these other topics are still open for discussion, not today, probably in future, and also in academic papers and conferences. But this is how I developed, got back to the point where I said, let's give an introductory presentation where the audience can sit back and just enjoy it. We're not going to go into a hardcore conversation, hardcore arguments regarding what is vernacular, why this, why that. Sit back and just enjoy it. Okay, let's look at the geographic location or the geographic area that we're talking about. And I don't have a clear map indicating the individual farms that will be addressed and where they are. The map on the left-hand side is a geological map of the Pretoria region. Of course, the little bit right in the center showing what Pretoria looks like is a blatant lie. I assume it was drafted by a geologist or his apprentice, because Pretoria never looked like that. But let that go. It's not a conversation or an argument for today. What is more significant is that on the geological map, one can see the Magaliesberg Ridge running from east to west, the principal barrier between what we have in Pretoria and what is north of Pretoria. Then the Daspoort Ridge, which breaks up over here. And then the Tyndall Ridge, Tyndall geological structure. And significant is this blue area, which of course is all dolomites. And the basic topography falls from, this is Highveld, bit of Middelveld, and there you have almost the beginning of Bushveld. So you have water popping up from the fountains, this part of Pretoria, and the water drains towards Pretoria and it drains through the various breaks in the Magaliesberg and Daspoort. The other significant element on this geological map is that little drop over there, that orange drop. That is a kimberlite diamond pipe on the farm Hartebeestpoort. Hartebeestpoort is where the Polokwane-Pietersburg freeway cuts through the Magaliesberg, right over there. And that land there is called Hartebeestpoort. It says there Hartebeestpoort. Now, the farms that we will be talking about, you will, as we go through the presentation, the names will probably be quite, you will know the names. The map on the right-hand side is a subdivision of the same area with farms dating to the period more or less 1900. This is a JEPI map of around about 1900. And the farms that I have visited go beyond our eastern boundary and also go beyond our western boundary. The others, most of them focus in this area. There's Wonderboom, which I will be talking about. Then the other prominent farms are Waterkloof on this side. There's Bronkhorst and Zwartkoppies. The other one is Pienaarspoort and Zwartkoppies. That's a Sammy Marks farm. Then the Willows over here. Hartebeestpoort 308, Hartebeestpoort 304. This is most of what we see here in that area indicated by the cursor belong to the Erasmus family. Quite a dynamic family who had farms, proclaimed their own farms, and another farm belonging to them was Wonderboom over there. Those are the twin brothers Doors and his brother Lawrence, who had that farm, and we will be talking about that. So this gives you an indication of the area And I'm sorry that I can't give you a map indicating exactly which farms I'm looking at. That is, of course, this particular map plus that map is an entire lecture. There's enough material there for an entire lecture in terms of early settlement and farm development and the use of existing building materials or building materials in this particular area, because this is a unique area geologically and geographically and topographically. If you want to construct your own dwelling, there's ample building material and there's enough material by starting off with these two maps, and I'm not going to expand on that. Now, of course, the Act says we need to look for a pattern. Are there any patterns? Now, pattern can be translated into a typology. And trying to answer the questions indicated by the Act is that I need to look and work or create a typology. Otherwise, there's nothing that I can determine or can value or can compare. Now, one of the first experiments, not really an experiment in the scientific, from a scientific point of view, was this particular building during the time of the ZAR, Kruger's reign. The ZAR took part in the international exhibition in Europe in 1900. And the contribution of the ZAR to that international exhibition was to construct a little farm dwelling at that exhibition. Now, what is the message? The message is, how did they decide on what would be typical? Because one would assume that they would erect a building that would be typical or considered to be typical of the region or of the people at the time. So it is clear that what we see here, this building was erected at the exposition, to some extent, that is what they considered to be a farmhouse. And that was supposed to represent the ZAR at the time. Very few people know that we took part in this exposition. Of course, it was also the same building, I think, was erected in Paris, but it was also in Dordrecht, according to one of the sources, it says it was erected in Dordrecht. What we see here is a little gable building. It's a core building with a lean-to, which was probably originally a stoep or a veranda, and eventually it became a kitchen and now a stoepkamer. And what is significant is a little domed thatched house out there, probably sending the message too that this was the workers' dwelling, the laborers' dwelling. But this is a very unique piece of history in our architectural history of the Transvaal and the ZAR. One or two articles have been published by individuals on this particular topic. And as far as I know, there's a lot of information on this exposition of the ZAR with lovely photographs of this particular event and the building. To the side of it is a very, I call an elementary typology for farm dwellings between the period 1840 to 1905 that I've drafted. Of course, each of them is a type, and there may be a variety of types within this typology. There's also a variety of that and a variety of this. The one at the top is the cup-style type structure. It's usually a single room structure with a timber frame, no walls. The roof also serves as a wall. And in most of the cases, especially in the Transvaal, where these appeared, they were temporary structures. Up in the Namaqualand Northwest, people tend to live in buildings like that. Then the very simple cottage, which one can also translate to being a hut or a single-roomed little house with walls and a hipped roof. Between that and that, there's another type. That's the half-walled structure, and I'll just show you what that looked like. The other one, the principal issue here is its scale. And in the floor plan, it is one room deep. And what the difference between that one and that one is a more sophisticated model in this one. And often it was a double room deep, 2 rooms deep. with a wider elongated floor plan, also with a kitchen at the back, often added later, not as part of the original floor plan. And I will show you examples of that. Because these were all done in thatch, clay and thatch structures. Then you get this type of building, which represents the Victorian architecture, Victorian architecture, not the Victorian period, and also a bit of the Edwardian period. This animal expanded quite exponentially in terms of style, form, size, building materials, and so on. I'm not going to spend much time on this. My focus will be on these two. Now, within that particular typology, this is what one would expect. The floor plan would remain the same. It's probably a single-story building, and it can either have a flat roof, it can have a hipped roof or a saddle roof, or this parapet free gable structure. Now, this was an original typology that I worked on, and fieldwork indicated to me that I need to include the rondable hut. The rondable hut has been vernacularized, or has been fused in or blended into, let's call it European or early Boer vernacular architecture. It was not only used and constructed by Black indigenous peoples. It became part of our vernacular architecture tradition. And I will indicate to you in what way it was integrated and fused over time. Quite a unique tendency in the northern part of the region north of the Fall River, and it also appeared often in the Pretoria area. Now, none of these things happened as in isolation. One building was not erected, and that was the beginning and the end of the farmstead and of the residence or of the dwelling. These things may have happened over a period of time. It may happen that you have 3 of these types on one farmstead, as is the case here. This is a drawing made by Erich Meyer. This was up north of the Magali, north of the Soutpansberg. Originally, this little farm dwelling consisted of a square hut, square davel, if you like. There's one on this side, one on that side, and eventually they were connected with an area in between with a little kitchen and another rondavel. These two were square, and this one was a typical rondavel. And Meyer stayed with these people. He made several drawings from different angles of this particular farmstead. I also discovered one of these up in the Mapangupe area in deep northern Transvaal, deep Limpopo. Let's refer to some of these earlier types then as, let's call them frontier types. And I date them to prior to the Anglo Boer War, 1899 to 1902, especially then prior to 1900. And those typical frontier types is represented even in early Pretoria photographs and early Pretoria architecture. As you can see here, this was the original raadsaal on the square. We're now looking up Market Street, now Paul Kruger Street. We're looking south towards Pretoria Station. What we have here is a free gable parapet roof, thatched roof with a very simple veranda. That was the raadsaal. But it was the same vocabulary right at the back. When we look at the back, there are the dwellings. The dwellings and the raadsaal look exactly the same. Maybe in scale different, but the architectural vocabulary is the same. At the back, you have a flat roof dwelling, which is more an urban type. Not that often that you would find this in the Pretoria area. I haven't come across any, in fact, in the Free State, yes, and in the Karoo, that's was quite often a farm dwelling type. The hipped roof type at the back, and there a hipped roof with a veranda also done in thatch around the dwelling, which is quite a unique ensemble of frontier type dwellings, which you would also find. They are actually rural types, farm type buildings, but they existed in the city center of Pretoria. Another one, this is a single room deep dwelling, very simple farm dwelling. There you have the varnish. The varnish is probably much larger than the dwelling. And this was photograph taken by Grow in the 1880s in the Rustenburg area. There's a wagon coming into the farmstead Very simple lifestyle. You have a core building with a front veranda and a lean-to at the back, which eventually became the norm, it seems, during these frontier years. This dwelling existed on the farm, or the bottom right corner. This dwelling existed on the farm Doornkloof. Farm Doornkloof belonged to Nellmapius, and he later sold off a portion to Jannie Smuts. But this is one of the first mud-walled and hip-roof dwellings on the farm Doornkloof, and a similar mud wall, this is rammed earth, and thatch roof dwelling existed on the farm Zwartkoppies. That is the farm where Sammy Marks bought the farm, and this dwelling existed when he bought the farm. And I don't know whether he actually forced his wife to live there when he brought her in from England, but I think that was probably the Rubicon he had to cross to build a large mansion for his British wife. Let's start off. What I've tried to do is to do the presentation in some sort of chronological order in terms of age, first, second, and so on. What were the first dwellings that existed? One of the oldest dwellings in the Pretoria area is the so-called Bronkhorst dwelling. Bronkhorst settled in the Fountains Valley near the fountains from the Dolomites in that area. There's nothing left of the dwelling. Currently, it's a mud tell, and there's I think it's proclaimed, I'm not sure, but there's nothing left. So the question here is, what could it have looked like? Was it a structure like that? We know it's probably not something like that. This is the typical Kapstyle range of types, because in the 1950s and even later, a very low rectangle of stone and mud remained. So that dwelling was probably, the first dwelling may have looked like that, but that was probably replaced with something else. It could have been something like this, what I call a half-wall dwelling, with an entrance that side or that side. When the archaeological excavations were done on site, there was an entrance in the one elevation on this side, but without the little supporting walls over there. This typology, or this type, belongs to this typology. And one wonders whether this may have been the case that he lived there. Elsewhere in the Roggeveld, farmhouses looked like this, which is to some extent an extension, a bigger, larger, and a more formal dwelling. As you can see, the scale of the woman in the door is a human scale, whereas these doors may have been a bit lower. What we do know is it was a rectangular dwelling similar to that. Now, this is a recording done by James Walton of early farm dwellings in the Free State. And we take our cue from the Walton source. In terms of context, this is a photograph taken around about 1885 of an early frontier farmer in the Magaliesberg near Rustenburg, and it gives you an indication of the visual characteristics of such a farmstead: stone walling surrounding the farmstead, the type of dwelling, hipped roof with even a thatched veranda with some other supporting outbuildings. It, to some extent, is very simple, but we don't know, we don't have any evidence regarding the Fountains Valley house or the Bronkhorst dwelling, whether it looked exactly like this. So that is still an academic question. Then we jump to the Silverton pioneer dwelling. That was on the farm Hartebeestpoort. According to the sources, this particular dwelling, that's the one at the top, as most of us know it, it was, according to our sources, erected between 1848 and 1952. It may even be 2 or 3 years later. We don't have the exact evidence or the knowledge of when that happened. The indication why I've put in both photographs, this is why we know the little whitewashed dwelling. And this is what it looked like in 2015 when we removed all the plaster and replastered it with mud clay and rethatched it. comparing this particular dwelling, this visual presentation with what we have on the left-hand side, this is an old farm dwelling that was recorded by a researcher in the Waterberg. I don't know the exact location of it, but this is an early farm dwelling. Very little difference. The difference is probably scale. This is a single room deep, same there, single room deep, and it belongs to this particular typology, that particular typology. The current dwelling also has a kitchen at the back, and we will look at that. There's the kitchen at the back, as recorded or as done in a lino cut by Pienaarspoort. Similar to this particular dwelling, look at it from the back, the kitchen side, in a very old drawing of one of the travelers. He did a drawing of this Martin Melk farmstead near the Berg River in the Cape. You see the Berg River going there right at the back. And this looks quite similar to what we have over here, which indicates that this is a typical frontier dwelling where people, they're not really interested in doing something that's very stylish. It's supposed to serve the purpose of the landowner and his wife. You have to live there because conditions tell you that this is the essential building that is needed as a shelter. The other photograph that I've included is an old photograph on the farm Orange Grove in Johannesburg with a dwelling. Now the veranda has been closed off with 2 stoepkamers, but it's once again, it is a heap thatch roof, or to some extent a half heap, resembling the same type of curve that was quite often used in the Boerland area and further in the northwest, with a separate kitchen. This is the detached kitchen. The house didn't have a kitchen, as you can deduct from the chimney. There's a hearth inside, and this is the varnish. Now the varnish, I can keep you busy for the rest of the day talking about varnishes and varnish typology. I have published articles on this particular topic. What is clear here is the method of building. This is done in rammed earth. It's a rammed earth building, similar to this building, but it's not been plastered. And I will expand on that as we go along. When we look at the Pioneer House, this is the house as it looks like now. I've taken the roof off. This is the northern elevation. This is the southern elevation. The original part of this dwelling was this part over here. It consisted of 3 rooms, being a voorkamer and a bedroom, and this is the front entrance. That room was added later. And as we continued with research and even archaeological exposure of the structure, it seems as if this used to be a boys' room. The moment boys reach teenage age, they tend to move out of the house and they go and live outside. This is after the restoration of the dwelling, and this is what it looks like now. As part of turning this into a dwelling, a functional habitat for a family, a kitchen was added to the southern side of the dwelling. Now, once again, I can keep you busy for an hour. I can give you a whole lecture just on the history of this particular house with all its various details. The oldest section of the dwelling is constructed of rammed earth. That section became dilapidated and was, during one of the restoration phases, was removed and replaced with commercial bricks and then plastered again with clay. That section is quite sturdy. There's no cracks there. The only risky area of this entire addition is the gable ends, which keeps on giving us problems. I'm not going to spend much time on that. What is indicated in this drawing is how a basic floor plan in the early years were expanded to the sides, either to the sides or at the back, seldom to the front. This dwelling, of course, didn't have a veranda, neither in front or at the back. Now, how did they? One of the other options to construct a dwelling like this was to do it large enough, create a framework, and then subdivide the interior spaces. That could have been done in a variety of ways. And we have evidence that these early dwellings were often subdivided only with a screen. Now that screen can either be a piece of calico or textiles, woven textile, or grass matting. And that can eventually become a wall. That, of course, that subdivision can be either on that side of the front door or this side, and then you subdivide the interior. That is then eventually replaced with a low wall or a half wall up to ceiling height, sometimes even lower than that. And then even more subdivisions, and eventually the subdivisions would probably go up right to the height of the surrounding walls. This is not common for Pretoria. This is quite common for the Waterberg area. It depends on the habitat where these buildings occurred. Then one of the other farmsteads around Pretoria, this is the Wonderboom farm dwelling. It is a proclaimed heritage site, and the city council in their wisdom allowed it to be demolished a few years ago. The entire site was demolished and cleared by a caterpillar because the city council appointed a contractor to solve the problem of vagrants. So they just cleared the whole lot. There was also a cemetery, and that was also cleared. What we see here is a very fancy dwelling. We have, I'll show you in the plans that although the house looks fairly large, it is, when you draw a line there and there, it's a single room deep dwelling with very fancy Cape Dutch gables. Pienaarspoort did an oil painting of the house with a rondel and a little thatched shed next to it. He also did a watercolor of the same building, and he also did a lino cut. This was from the this is a western elevation, this is an eastern elevation. There are several other drawings, such as an Erich Meyer drawing also done of this. And then somebody like Colby van Terburg copied an Erich Meyer drawing, and this is what her drawing looked like. Now, what popped out in this particular drawing is the building right at the back, which looks like a Karoo type dwelling, northwest building. In the drier parts of South Africa, this was probably the rule of thumb in terms of dwellings. In this case, this is not the principal dwelling. This is the principal dwelling. What also pops up here, once again, is the presence of a rondel and the open-sided thatched structure over there and also over there, indicating and suggesting that all dwellings, early dwellings, were surrounded by a number of other buildings and structures to support household activities. And I will show you, I think in the next frame, that is a more extended picture of the Wonderboom farmstead. It's also known as the Doors Erasmus dwelling. The road from Pretoria city comes through that little neck over there and passes here. That's the Wonderboom along the southern slopes of the Magaliesberg. This was the school, and there was the smithy. These buildings were all restored. I was there when it was restored, and there's nothing left currently. There you have a cattle kraal. That is all gone, even though it's a proclaimed heritage site. The original dwelling used to look like this. It was a 3-roomed voorkamer type dwelling, main entrance on that side, stoep. You would enter into the voorkamer, there would be a room on that side, room on that side. Implying then that all your ablution facilities, kitchen facilities, must have been outside. We don't know where. And soon after they probably moved in, they realized they had to expand. One of the easy ways to expand and change the floor plan was to close off a section of the front stoep, turning it into a little stoepkamer, and also adding some more rooms right at the back, probably in a lean-to fashion, as we can see there, and then formalized with plastered brick walling. And some of the rooms inside, this was a huge area. It was subdivided, was large enough to be subdivided into bedrooms. And I'm still working on an extension of the floor plan that has not been completed yet. Getting back to another museum site, this is the Kaalfontein site at the east of Pretoria. It's beyond Donkerhoek. Indication of what the house looks like now. This is the southern facade. This is what it looks like. The original entrance towards the farmhouse was from this side towards the Zwane. This would be south, this is west. Now, the interesting aspect here is that the kitchen is located over here. There's a pantry. This chimney indicates the kitchen, which has now been integrated into the house, but still with an outdoor oven and the milk room, the coal room, the baking room in a separate dwelling. And right at the back, there's another rondel, and there's even another one around the corner with a huge paved backyard linking all these additional supporting buildings with a kitchen, supporting the house. So what does it mean to dwell? In this case, implies that you have a core and a variety of buildings and structures around you functioning as a cube or a module, surrounded by other modules and some open space in between. This is what the farmhouse looked like currently. The core of this dwelling, very similar to the Doors Erasmus dwelling. You have a voorkamer with 2 bedrooms. And eventually there was right from the start, there was a veranda, as you can see on that side. And then they had a stoop at the back, and the stoop was eventually closed off. And a kitchen was added. There's a pantry and a bathroom. So the ablution facilities or the bath facilities, cleaning facilities, were eventually included into the floor plan. What is significant and unique to this house, and I've just completed an article on the unique and odd aspects of this particular farmhouse, is the fact that the Zwane and the dwelling has been fused under a single roof. This is what we see. There is only a firewall in between the Zwane section and the dwelling section. Indicating here, in terms of ornament, this is what the veranda looks like now. But around about 1905, 1904, this was what this particular house looked like from the front. There's one of the Prinsloo guys, and this is the guy by the name of Weller. He was the Cullinan mine manager, and he came to visit Prinsloo probably to brag about the discovery of the largest diamond ever found in South Africa. So this gives you an indication of what the old farmhouse looked like. During restoration, that was what was left. It's still possible to restore it, but this is quite an historic photograph. This odd triangular thing is still there. You can compare it with what is on the site still. All the woodwork and the ornamentation have disappeared. Then another obscured farmhouse is the farmhouse of Fred and Harry Struben on the farm, the Willows. It is near the Grove, for those of you who know the eastern part of Pretoria well. The farm is, or this farmstead is located near the Grove. I know very little about this. I've only visited it and took some pictures while I was in there. Quite a unique structure. What is unique? Why do I call this unique? The entire front stoop of the dwelling is done with shale paving. And we all know shale is not you won't get the first prize for using shale as a construction material or as a paving material. As you can see, it is all crumbled away. And here they've used it as a pedestal for cast iron columns over there. The veranda is supported by cast iron columns, and it's still there. This is quite a unique thing in our farm architecture. Cast iron is not a common material used on farms. What I also spotted in the house, of course, is, and this is our first introduction to J.J. Kirkness's famous fireplaces. This is a kit fireplace that appears in the dwelling. I haven't recorded the dwelling. I still don't have floor plans. I will still need to go and do that. And this is in the museum collection. I discovered a photograph of the dwelling done by Pienaarspoort. Where it came from, I still don't know. There are many things in the museum that you pop or that you discover and you don't know where they come from. Nobody else can tell you where they come from. Very interesting dwelling, very simple in its design and its facade and arrangement of windows and doors. Then a dwelling which probably most of you know about. This is the Zwartkoppies farm principal dwelling, the main dwelling. I can keep you busy for 2 days talking about this dwelling, which I will not do here. I would merely introduce it to you It is a Victorian dwelling. Some people would say this is not really Victorian. I've published an article on the Victorian aspects of the dwelling. 2003, it was republished in 2005. There are so many elements in this building in terms of how it originated and how it was extended, added onto, altered over time. And currently the floor plan is quite extensive. I'm not going to talk about the surrounding supporting outbuildings, which is completely a different lecture. Currently the house looks like this. The original dwelling was this part of the floor plan with a kitchen and a dining room over here. Eventually they altered the house and they added a top floor, and even more recent, they added an entire kitchen annex with a little portal linking the kitchen to the main dwelling. Now, when you read up on Victorian preferences and biases at the time, that was quite typical, that you would have an area with, this entrance over here was the original entrance into the so-called hall or foyer. That was a ceremonial entrance that was added later. It never existed. There was just a veranda going straight through there. In the Victorian times, you would have the entertainment public area. People would then enter. Then you have the living area, also with the top. And then you would have the service area. And the servants were not supposed to mingle or mix with the social activities of guests and other family members visiting the particular dwelling. So from a social point of view, there's a lot we can talk about. From an architectural point of view and period point of view, there's a lot we can talk about, but we're already running out of time. Supporting the Sammy Marks house, this is just a general map diagram indicating the position of the principal dwelling. There were 5 other supporting dwellings or cottages, and I don't have pictures of all of them here. The one, here they are. The one was the farm manager's cottage. That's next to the horse stables and cow stables. It's this building over here. It's still there. Dairy cottage, I don't have a picture of that because this became a huge dairy farm at some stage. And dairy cottage is linked to the dairy itself. Then the Jill's cottage. Jill's cottage is this building over here. It's still there. And Potts cottage is this little building over here. I have plans of all of them, but I'm not going to discuss it, and I haven't included. I've taken it out, otherwise I would talk for the next 2 hours. Then another rare building, very few people know about this. It's the so-called Wolmarans dwelling. It's along the western slopes of the Donkerhoek ridge, which forms a part of the Magaliesberg, the end of the Magaliesberg at the eastern side, where the freeway towards Witbank cuts through that part of the Magaliesberg. This dwelling is located on that ridge. I think it is now being included, engulfed by extensions of Mamelodi. And somebody made this drawing. I've been to the house once and took one picture, and that's a black and white picture, which I couldn't use. But some other wise, very wise person did a drawing of this house, the so-called Wolmarans house. The house is elevated above the ground because probably of the slope. There's quite a steep slope. The house faces westward. This would be north, that would be west. And there's quite a steep slope from this side downwards towards the entrance, the gate. That is the floor plan. We will look at the floor plan just now. And this intelligent person made drawings of this dwelling, and it's the only record we have of this particular house. Now let's quickly look at the floor plan because there are some very useful messages in assessing this floor plan. This is the main entrance, and there's a U-shaped veranda around that particular part of the house. So what we have here is almost one dwelling, another building, and another section over there. What we have here is what some people would refer to as a shotgun house, implying when the front doors open, you can shoot right through the house out through the back door. And the same intelligent person indicated over there, they call it the threshold or the fringe area of the building. It's over there. Very interesting division, very interesting and a very useful observation. Then the semi-public or formal rooms, this is the drawing room and the study and so forth. It's up to this particular part. There's the hall, so you have a little porch over there, entering into the hall. Then you have a passage, and there's a clear division between the hall and the passage. Once again, a clear division between this section, that section. And then the private or informal part of the house. This is that area over here. It's almost a second dwelling. And then the service center, that's where the kitchen is located. Now, when you look at the house in terms of other drawings, this seems to have been added on later, almost as a lean-to, which is typical of Boer farmhouses. But the entire character is very Victorian, erected at the same time as the Sammy Marks house, but in much smaller scale. What is significant, though, is the entrance, the introduction of the passage as a service center, as a spine, which didn't exist in the earlier frontier dwellings. So we can carry on this one, but this is enough for now. In the south of the city, of course, is the farm Irene or Doornkloof. Doornkloof was bought by Nellmapius at some stage, and this was the house that he erected. What I've included here is that this is a typical, very suave farmhouse by this fancy, very suave European guy, immigrant, Nellmapius. And this is the type of lifestyle he liked, and this is what he would like to project of himself. Now, the date of this particular house coincides with the date of dwellings in early Pretoria in Church Street. This is Church Street on the right-hand side. They're still busy constructing the Union buildings on this side. There you have Church Street. And this particular cluster of buildings I've enhanced. This was about 1910, 1911, 1912. And I've enhanced it. This is what I call, and that is what I used in my typology right in the start, is what I call the gable and veranda dwellings. Quite common in this particular area, right through Arcadia, Sunnyside, Clydesdale, and even in Hatfield. But it never became a popular type as a farm building. So it became a popular type probably because most of these buildings could have been ordered from a catalogue. It was never popular as a farm building around Pretoria. I've never come across one similar to these. The nearest I can get to that was this building over here. I haven't been to this farm looking at the Van der Bijl dwelling, which is also on the same farm. That still needs to be explored. Then a very rare building, but it's a few Pretorians know about this building. The old man Erasmus, the entire Erasmus family, when they settled in the Pretoria area and not bought farms, they just annexed, laid out farms according to their own liking. Old man Erasmus's farmhouse is this one on the farm Randjesfontein. Randjesfontein is where Midrand was eventually established, on the farm Randjesfontein. And this building, plus his outbuildings, supporting outbuildings, still exist. It's a huge building. Some of it burned down during the Anglo Boer War, but it was rebuilt in the 20th century. I still haven't done any drawings on this building, but it is still there. It belongs to the City Council of Johannesburg. At this stage, I don't think they know what to do with it, but it is still there. But it's an Erasmus building, that's why I've included it. And the Erasmus family history is closely related to the Pretoria history. Then some more farm buildings that very few people know about. Let's go to the next one. We all know the castle. That's on the farm. I think the farm is Gartsfontein, I'm not sure. We all know this building. But on that same site, two other farm buildings are located on that site. These farm buildings existed on the farm, but when the Nell Armscor bought the land, they wanted to demolish it, and it was decided to relocate them and reconstruct them around the old castle. And I haven't been to these buildings yet. That's why there's no text with these buildings. I don't know which photographs belong to which of these buildings. And I seriously would like to get access to the site. I have trouble getting access to the site to visit these buildings and record them, and even to visit this particular building. Now, this is also a unique building because it's an urban dwelling type in a farm setting, and I've really called it, it's odd and it's absolutely rare. This typology speaks the same language as this typology. These examples were taken, these photographs were taken of examples in New York and San Francisco. And it's referred to as the Queen Anne style. Even though this building dates back to 1902, just after the Anglo Boer War, and also belonged to an Erasmus, it is completely rare and odd. It's to some extent really eccentric. It doesn't fit in anywhere in our vernacular architecture typology for farm buildings. And it would probably take another year or so to really fathom all the details in this building and try to contextualize it, why it's important. The only thing now is to say it's so unique that that is why it's important, and because of its scale and the family history and so forth. But this is a comparative material. If you want to compare that, want to determine a value or do a proper academic evaluation, this is the comparative material. In Pretoria city centre, you may find 1 or 2 or 3 of these buildings, not in the same style, not the same use of timber in the structure, but this is quite a unique and an odd building. Pity that the public doesn't have access to the building. Then also to the south, also on the farm, Doornkloof, of course, is the now known, well-known Smuts house. And I'm not going to expand much on this. I have a floor plan of the dwelling. I'm currently busy measuring it up to do metric measures and elevations of this building. Very, very unique site, very, very unique building, and a very, very unique person who was responsible for the construction of this building, because it's a corrugated iron building and it dates back to the Anglo Boer War, times of the Anglo Boer War. This is the main entrance. This is the back of the building soon after it was erected. And its origin was from Middelburg, where it was a military, a mess which formed part of the military cantonments. Now, even a study on cantonments would take you to New York. It would take you to especially India and all the British colonies where they had cantonments. Now, the nearest I could get in terms of old military buildings comparing to this house is this one over here. Currently, the Smuts house looks similar to this from the front and also from the side. This particular little ventilator projecting aspect there is similar to what you have there. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on this particular dwelling. It's also unique. It's not odd, but it is rare, and it represents so many things in our history, and especially the Pretoria history, and completely underrated in terms of its place value and its sense of place. Also a little jewel, a rare building that few people know about. This is also on the farm Kaalfontein, and it belongs to the museum. Very few people go there because they don't know about it. It's a little cottage. It's referred to as a 1913 cottage. It is a dwelling, but the measurements of this little building is almost like a poppies, like a little doll's house. It's a double room, deep floor plan with the main entrance on this side, with a lot of extensions or additions on the western side of the building. So the original building was only this bit over here. Let's call it that part over there. That has been added on. That is what it looks like from the back. And this was a little cottage. It's been restored. It's going to be cleaned up again in the next year, and it's fully furnished. So it's quite a jewel in terms of a destination to visit. Right, Hartebeestpoort, I've introduced to you very briefly when I said there's a diamond pipe on the farm, and that's where the freeway to Polokwane cuts through the farm. This property belongs to the city council. It's a huge old farm dwelling, similar in style to the Randjesfontein farm dwelling. There was also a Wolmarans living there, and some historic things happened at that particular property. The floor plan has been drafted very sketchily and has been analyzed by one of my colleagues, Irene, many, many years ago. And I didn't include it, otherwise it would have kept us busy for another half an hour. This is just the sketch that Hannes Meyer made of the drawing while he was still alive. It's not in our collection. Then another missing dwelling. This is also on the farm Wonderboom. I just refer to it as Wonderboom 2. It's known as the Boysen dwelling. As you can see, it's a single room deep structure, but it was demolished. It was located just east of the Doors Erasmus dwelling. Very little known. It's not been recorded. So it was part of our history, very early history. It was not recorded, no drawings, nothing, no photographs of this particular dwelling. This is only a photograph in our museum of this particular dwelling. Erich Meyer did a drawing, a watercolor of this particular dwelling and the farmstead, which I've published in an article on Erich Meyer some months ago. Then a new category of farm architectural vocabulary, and this is probably one of the best examples, the best collection of examples occurs on the farm, the Pelendaba farm. The farm is associated with Gustav Preller and Eugene Marais. This is the Gustav Preller dwelling at the back. There's a huge enclosure at the back, surrounded by rondavels right at the corners of the square atrium. And this is what is now used as the guest house, but it was also this is a proper rondavel dwelling. And this is where Eugene Marais shot himself, in this house. And it's a few, probably 30, 40 meters away from this particular house. Now, I've also published on the rondavels and rondavel dwellings. I've published a number of articles on them. And I'm not going to expand on them. We are really running out of time, but this is one of the best examples. Unfortunately, the public doesn't have access to these buildings, and I don't know whether the NAS, what do they call themselves, the old Pelendaba people, or whether they still use these buildings. But this is a significant contribution to our farm architecture, is the rondavel and the fusion of the rondavel into a dwelling. This is just to expand on the same issue. This is the farm Rietfontein and the dwelling on the farm Rietfontein. I'm not sure about the name. The name could be different. One of my colleagues need to confirm it. The floor plan of this dwelling indicates something very interesting. There you have the old-fashioned dwelling with a little passage and a portal with a toilet, bathroom on that side, lean-to that side, and two rondavels have been fused into the floor plan to become stoepkamers. And this has happened quite often. And I'm currently working on a house in Silverton, in the urban area, where similar things have happened. So there must have been a spirit at this particular time. This was the 20s, 30s, where this became a very popular solution to vernacularize your dwelling, was the inclusion of rondavels. That is just a typology that I have drafted in terms of different types of rondavel and rondavel houses and how they were eventually fused. Once again, there's a drawing of Erich Meyer of that same farmstead I showed you earlier, of rondavels plus the square davel that have been fused into one farmhouse. This is another excellent example of an old farmhouse that it didn't operate as a dwelling, as a single dwelling. It operated as separate units, detached separate units. And over time, it became one single farmhouse where all the open spaces in between were fused. This particular topic is so extensive, it can probably cover several master's theses and PhD theses. The way the rondavel has been vernacularized into our farm architecture. Okay, this is another jewel that very few people know about. This is a farmhouse I came across in the Rietvlei Dam Nature Reserve, and I only took some quick pictures. I don't have any drawings. It belongs to the city council. It's an Edwardian dwelling, huge dwelling. I don't know what they use it for. One of the unique aspects here is the repeat of the cast iron columns, reappearance or similar use of the cast iron columns to support the veranda, which we saw in the Fred and Harry Struben dwelling on the Willows. See, we're running out of time. The period 1920, 1935, and these are really merely introductions to other farm dwellings that are still out there. This one is in Moraletta Kloof. It's open to the public. It is I think a restaurant currently, quite a monumental building with a wonderful view across the eastern parts of Pretoria from that front stoep. Then this is a old farm dwelling constructed with quartzite, Magaliesberg quartzite, very rough copy clip construction. There are plans of the dwelling. I don't have those plans. I don't even know what the name of the site is. So I only refer to it as a dwelling in Acacia. I'm still trying to figure out what is the name of this particular site. There are several buildings on this site constructed in the same architectural vocabulary and building materials. Then once again on the farm Kaalfontein, this property also belongs to Ditsong. This is so-called 1927 dwelling. I have floor plans of and elevations of this dwelling. It has not been analyzed. It's still functioning. It's been repaired, and I think it's been rented out. Then the other well-known farm is, of course, Hazeldean. That is across the road from Sammy Marks, from Zwartkoppies, but I couldn't get access to the lovely historic farm dwellings on that farm. This is just a picture of the extent of the stables, cow stables on Hazeldean. There's also a lovely double-story house with a gable, not the same, much more elaborate gable. This is the only picture I could take on that farm. It's work that still needs to be done. Then let's jump into the Centurion area, the so-called Roy's Kraal dwelling, period 1950 to 1930. This is the period of gables and verandas with these cigar-shaped columns. The building is still used. It also belongs to the city council. I don't know what they use it for. It used to be a Chinese restaurant, and then they closed it. I don't know, probably for health reasons. Wonderful solid house, no cracks in it. I don't have plans for it. That gives you an indication of a bit of the farm yard with the old Zwane, solid stone Zwane. I think we're nearing the end now. And then some other farm dwellings north of the Magaliesberg. This is the Fritz dwelling. I think that has been demolished. This is the Sinovich dwelling. Sinovich is the name of the family after which Sinoville was named. Lovely solid stone gable with a bay window, semicircular bay window, lovely ornamental application of brickwork. There are some more photographs of that. Then the Rossi dwelling, this dwelling, that dwelling, the Fritz dwelling, oh, sorry. The Fritz dwelling, the Sinovich dwelling, and the Rossi dwelling are all in the way of the so-called Rainbow Junction development north of the Magaliesberg. So they are endangered. That one I think is already gone. This one is endangered if it hasn't been removed already. This one, I don't know whether it's still there. And then even towards Acacia, there's a dwelling in Chantal. I don't have plans of this one. I have photographs of that, none of that, none of that. So that just expands on the variety that we still have, and they have not been touched in terms of recording or even being investigated or taken proper pictures of. Then this is what I conclude with. I am not going to go into building materials, but I must mention the contribution of Kirkness to the architectural history of Pretoria. And that architectural history is not only in the formal architecture domain, which we find in abundance in Pretoria. It also occurs in the farm dwellings, especially after the Anglo Boer War period. This asks for a complete PhD or a master's thesis to do a proper standard study, determining the norm and giving us a standard work, academic work on the work of Kirkness. And I think that concludes. I'm not going to take more of your time. There is my email right at the bottom. Thank you.